Alright guys, welcome back to Reprogramming Masculinity, where today we're going to do a video I'm actually quite excited for, but I know is probably going to piss some people off and ruffle a lot of feathers, because it's going to go entirely against the grain of what we were taught. And really the whole purpose of this video is to inspire people to start asking more questions, instead of just get defensive. So today we're going to be talking about how it's really not just my own personal belief. There's a huge amount of the science community who believes that the calorie in and of itself is not entirely the end-all be-all measurement to measure human metabolism. And I've also fallen into this camp. I don't believe that the calorie is the best form of measurement to measuring your food, to measure your nutrient intake, if the goal is composition. I'm going to get into why, and I'm going to start by showing you. So the calorie is measured in what's called a bomb calorimeter. This is what bomb calorimeters look like. This is how they're measured. You put food in here, all this heats up, it heats it up and heats it up until finally it combusts the food inside of this chamber. And the heat that is measured off of the combusted food is how we get the caloric measurement, essentially. And here is the equation by which this is measured. Scroll up and make sure you can see it. Basically, quality minus work equals the change in internal energy, or the heat added to the system. Quality minus work. So this is the equation that is often used on the back of our food labels. Right? We just don't see it as this, we see it as a number. But this is how that number is gathered. This equation right here. Very simple equation, especially when you consider that, of course, this is for a closed system within the law of thermodynamics. The problem is that humans are an open system. Okay, we are an open energy balance system. So the problem that you have here is that the closed system is only equating for energy, right? Energy in the form of heat. Now, as you can see here, I'll even highlight it, the calorie or the closed system equation is a small part of the open system equation, which is human beings. However, my problem, and I mean, this is ultimately the problem that the rest of the science community has with calories, is that this is not equating for all of this. Right? It's not equating for this huge, massive portion of the open system equation, which is human beings. Look at the difference here, guys. There's a massive difference in equation. And before we even get further into this, I would just like to point out that, the logic here when comparing these two is like saying the closed system equation, let's just say, is 5 plus 5 equals 10, right? It's a simple equation. So let's just use a simple equation as a comparison. 5 plus 5 equals 10. Down here, you've got 5 plus 5, right? Same as this up here. That's like saying 5 plus 5 times 10 divided by 3, multiply that by 128, and then square that to the 14th power. It's just like the equation becomes so complex that just because 5 plus 5 is up here and 5 plus 5 is also down here does not mean that the answer being 10 is going to also be the answer down here. Do you see what I'm saying here? I mean, it takes an incredibly ignorant perspective to think that these two equations are going to have the same outcome. Now, we can get into why. For one, here is a metabolic cart. They measure several different things that actually do tend to equate for the equation on this side of the screen here. So these carts measure what's called indirect calorimetry. It's the most commonly used method to measure human metabolism. Isn't that a funny statement? Because it would seem that direct calorimetry, right, the measurement of calories, is the most commonly used method to measure human metabolism. But look, this is telling you that indirect calorimetry is used to measure this. And this is primarily done through the metabolic carts, which I just showed you, right? These things measure oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production. It can calculate energy expenditure. It can calculate your resting metabolic rate and your substrate utilization, as in your fat versus carbohydrate oxidation. And this is a big one right here, because this goes into the Randall cycle. The Randall cycle is known as the glucose fatty acid cycle. It's a metabolic process that describes the reciprocal inhibition between glucose and fatty acid oxidation in tissues like muscle and adipose tissue. In short, the Randall cycle kind of sort of explains how the body really doesn't like burning both fuels at the same time. It really doesn't. The mitochondria does not prefer that. It prefers having one substrate to use at a time over another. And what tends to happen to the substrate that is not being used ends up being stored for a later use. So ultimately, you can have the caloric count on the back of something that's both high in fat and carbohydrates. And that caloric measurement might be telling you something, have 500 kcals of usable energy, but it's not going to measure how your body is actually allocating that energy, right? This is the big problem with calories. This is the problem with measuring calories to try and reach a body composition goal. Another thing that calories don't entirely equate for is something like gluconeogenesis. Right? The gluconeogenesis is the metabolic pathway by which quite a few different substrates like lactate, glycerol, pyruvate, and amino acids being the biggest trigger here is all substrates that can be used to create glucose. And glucose is one of the main justifications that are used in people having a high carbohydrate diet, because humans need glucose and carbohydrates get turned into glucose. And it doesn't take into account that, your body's capable of making glucose all on its own. It's capable of doing it through amino acids. And gluconeogenesis is something that's constantly running in the background. It's a very demand-driven mechanism, right? So if you're dumping a ton of carbohydrates down your gullet, gluconeogenesis is going to be really diminished and small in the background, but it's still going to be running regardless. Like, it's still going to be converting some of your protein into glucose. So, it's not taking into account that, substrates that typically aren't used for energy can be used for energy. It's not taking into account things like the thermic effect of these foods. For example, protein requires 25 to 30% of its potential heat energy just for digestion alone. It's an incredibly complex nutrient, and it takes a great deal of enzymatic activity to even break down protein in the first place, right? And protein's so complex and has so many different avenues and things that it can be converted into outside of cell regeneration, outside of muscle repair. It can be used for blood cell counts and keeping that within homeostasis. It can be used for hormones even. It can be broken down and used for hormone substrates and balancing hormones. It can be used for all sorts of different things. And this is something that the calorie isn't going to be able to take into account, because, again, the calorie, it measures the potential energy that something might have through oxidizing it or through combusting it. But the problem is, not only are humans not a furnace, and food is not coal, not only is that an issue, But there's also the issue that the calorie only measures the potential heat that can come off of food. It's not measuring how the body's actually allocating any of these nutrients once it's done oxidizing them and converting them enzymatically into different substrates. Right? These are biological and physiological processes. We're not turning food into ash here. Right? A flame in no way, shape, or form is ever introduced in this system. It's a system of enzymatically breaking things down through thousands of little processes and little avenues. And a big problem here is you also go into the fact that, like, a lot of scientists have even debated this by saying, look, the calorie is actually an equilibrated system. Okay, it's a system where things are fixed. It's a system where everything is accounted for. In contrast, a non-equilibrated system occurs when there is a sustained imbalance between calories in and calories out. This imbalance leads to changes in body composition. A chronic calorie surplus results in weight gain, primarily as fat, while a prolonged calorie deficit leads to weight loss. However, the body actively resists these changes, and this is our argument, okay, through metabolic adaptations, such as reduced resting metabolic rate. Okay, then this can change depending upon what you're eating and how much activity you're getting, what you do for a job, etc. All these different things can increase or decrease this. Decreased non-exercise activity. Oh, yeah. Okay, so that even kind of talks about some of these things. And increased hunger, which makes it harder to maintain fat weight loss or gain over time. These compensatory mechanisms mean that the system does not remain in a steady state, and external interventions like dieting or exercise are often required to shift the balance. And this is 100% true, guys. On paper, we like to believe that we are an equilibrated system, but unfortunately we are not. While the first law of thermodynamics confirms that energy cannot be created or destroyed, real-world human physiology adds complexity. The body is not a closed system. Metabolic efficiency, macronutrient composition, hormonal signals, circadian rhythms, and individual variability all influence how calories are used and stored. For example, a calorie is not always a calorie. The thermic effect of food varies by macronutrient and nutrient balance. It may be more effective for fat loss and muscle preservation than focusing solely on caloric balance. This makes a good point. Like, look, we are all genetically variable to some degree or another. We're all going to have different resting basal metabolic rates. And of course, these metabolic rates are going to increase or decrease based on how active you are in your life. You know, are you sitting at a desk all day while working? Or, you know, do you do manual labor? Are you constantly up and about and walking around? You know, is your job something that requires a great deal of focus and brain power? Because that's something that can also play a role in this. You know, there's so many different variables. How old you are, what gender you are, right? Because age and gender are going to play a part in this. Why does gender play a part in it? Different hormonal profiles, right? Different hormones are going to play a role in our metabolism. Do you have healthy, stable hormone levels for your gender and for your specific anatomy even? You know, have you been making lifestyle choices like drinking too much alcohol, doing drugs, all these different things that are going to affect your hormones? These are also things that are going to affect your metabolism, right? These are things that are going to affect the human system, which is a non-equilibrated system. There is no equilibrium in the human system. The human system is entirely adaptive. It's designed to not have equilibrium for the sake of being able to find homeostasis adaptively based on what you are doing. And that in and of itself is reduced and simplified by the calorie. And it's too reductionist of a measurement to actually be able to answer for body composition. And this is why, let's say someone has a really low protein diet, and let's say they have a really high fat and high carbohydrate diet anyways, and let's say they're obese and they're trying to lose some weight, and their goal here in their mind is to just reduce calorie count. Well, to them, that's probably going to look like reducing the amount of food that they're already eating, which is obviously triggering the ever-loving hell out of the Randall cycle. This is dictating that two fuel sources cannot compete for the same mitochondria. One will get stored over the other. And it's going to depend probably on what your gut is more adapted to. Are you used to eating more fats, or are you used to eating more carbohydrates? But that's besides the point. The point here is this is why someone can lose weight on the scale, and you can kind of sort of maybe see that a little bit in their overall structure, but at the same time their body composition doesn't look that much better. The person that's reflected back at them in the mirror might slightly just look like a smaller statured version of themselves before they even started this journey. The body composition isn't really changing. They're more than likely just losing muscle mass and maybe even a little bit of bone structure. But the body composition, the body fat, right, the adipose tissue that they're actually trying to target and lose is not being lost because they're triggering the Randall cycle and they're keeping that same degree of body fat on. So calories measure the potential energy that something might possess, but in no way, shape, or form does it actually measure how that energy is going to be utilized by your physiology, by your biochemistry, which is entirely unique to you. Look, guys, it's not to tear apart calories. It's not to say that calories don't have a place in this world. It's not to say that thermodynamics isn't real. All this stuff is real, and I'll go back to, like I said at the beginning, I'll end it by showing you again, look, I'm agreeing that, calories are a measurement by which thermodynamics in a closed system can be measured, and how the closed system equation is a small part of us as an open system. But just that my argument is it's leaving all of this on the table and isn't accounting for this. So, if you guys can understand how I would see this as a problem, the logical question then I imagine you guys are asking is, okay, well, if calories are too simplified to be able to account for the open system equation, which it clearly cannot, and all of these other different things that the metabolic carts measure does account for this, well then what exactly do we go by? Because obviously you can't stick the open equation and the equation for the basal metabolic rate and the equation for oxygen, carbon dioxide out. You can't stick all these different things on the back of food labels, right? So what do we go by? Very easy. You follow macros. In macronutrients, the count itself, the number itself, obviously still is not accounting for human variability, for individual variability. However, the macronutrient counts and you focusing on them is doing something crucially important in your brain. It is causing you to focus on what you are actually putting in your body. And it's making you conscious of questions like, okay, well then how much protein should I eat? How much carbohydrate should I reduce from my diet? How much fat should I eat? What are fats actually used for? What are fats? It starts making you question these things that calories make people too lazy to question. That's another big problem I have with calories, is it's intellectually lazy. And it's not to say that the mind that created the calorie and the bomb calorimeter in and of itself is lazy, but the application of it to food and how it's used in modernity is intellectually lazy and tries to simplify things so much that when you actually do begin to ask questions and you try and ask them in conjunction to still make it math with the calories, it only confuses it further and makes people give up trying to understand. So, moving forward, my advice to people, just pretend that calories as a form of measuring food does not exist, and pretend that macronutrients are literally the only number that you have to go off of. If you do that and start paying more attention to how much carbohydrates you're taking in, you'll start actually changing your real body composition. We need to relearn how to listen to our own satiety signals. If your goal, and I understand that not everyone here has the goal of being a world-class renowned bodybuilder. Not everyone has the goal of competing and dedicating their life to this. Totally understand. Don't blame you at all. Most guys just want to be relatively jacked and, have good levels of body fat. Want to be able to walk around with a constant six-pack that's almost always threatening to show itself even when you aren't flexing. And if you really truly want to get to that point, you have to learn to prioritize being able to listen to your own body. This is probably one of the only things about Arnold and what he used to teach that I actually really liked, was to listen to what the body is trying to tell you. And nutrition is probably one of the biggest things, because if you're eating an incredibly high protein, high fat diet like steak, you're not going to be overeating. Because you're not eating carbohydrates and fats together, most of those fats are going to be utilized for both energy and hormones. So people need to relearn how to listen to their own body, their own satiety signals, and we really need to re-educate ourselves and relearn what each nutrient is responsible for, the metabolic pathways that it's capable of going down, and the external demands that will either increase or decrease the need for these individual substrates. And the reason that that's important is, like, for example, gluconeogenesis, the ability to pull amino acids from your diet to create glucose. This is a demand-driven mechanism, right? So if you're not training, right, and let's say you work a desk job, let's say you're not a very active person at all in your life, don't go to the gym, don't go running or walking or any of this stuff, don't have an active job, but let's say you're staying relatively lean because of a carnivore diet. In that case, your gluconeogenesis needs, or your demand, is incredibly low. But the moment you start training, you start damaging your muscles, and you start using up all the glycogen in your muscles for working out, well, now the glucose demand is going to increase. Because the glucose demand increases to replace glycogen in the muscles, gluconeogenesis is going to increase. So yeah, man, that's my thoughts on this. As far as recommendations go, start with 1 gram per pound of body weight. Even if you're not active, especially if you're not active. If you're active, you're probably going to end up needing more, but that's something we can work on later. If you're active already, 1.5 grams, maybe. Somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 grams. And even then, it's all unique individual variability. There's variability in all of this. Now, from that protein number, let your fats be entirely guided based on your satiety and how you feel. If you feel hungry, if you feel craving, you need a little bit more fat. Go eat you a teaspoon or a tablespoon of butter. Eat a little bit of butter until your tummy feels satisfied and you're no longer craving. If it gets to a point where you're training and you need more protein, but you're struggling because of the fact that satiety is holding you back from getting more protein, protein shakes. Body has a much easier time assimilating nutrients through liquids than it seems to with solid foods. So, getting extra protein in through protein shakes is a hell of a lot easier than it is cooking up an additional steak and eating another steak. As far as carbohydrates go, the need for carbohydrates. For one, humans don't need them to survive. All carbohydrates are capable of doing is becoming glucose. They're just a precursor to glucose. That's all carbohydrates are. And we've already established through gluconeogenesis that the body can get glucose in other ways that are running in the background anyways, whether you're eating carbohydrates or not. They're entirely non-essential to the survival of a human being. Now, let's say you were to acknowledge and say, okay, I agree. Carbohydrates aren't necessary, but let's say the 3 or 4 days after recovery, I don't want to feel like I'm drained of energy because gluconeogenesis is taking a little bit longer to replace my muscle glycogen than I would like. In which case, okay, maybe you can make a case for eating a meal with carbohydrates initially after your workout, but the rest of the week, nah, it's not necessary. You don't need glucose precursors when your body is more than capable of creating glucose on its own. I'll say it as a matter of fact. It would rather do it through gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis has checks and balances to keep your blood glucose levels as stable as they should be. It will convert exactly as much glucose as the body needs and not a single gram more. When you're supplementing an outside source of carbohydrates, you're ultimately playing guesswork in a system that you can't possibly mathematically equate. Just let gluconeogenesis take care of that job. Aside from that, guys, my recommendation is animal-based. The more animal-based you become, the better off you're going to be and feel. Come back next time for either another workout video, where I'll be putting the boys through the ringer. I'm recording tomorrow with them. More discipline videos. The next discipline video I'm going to be recording is discipline of the tongue. It's a hard one. Something I've been working on a lot recently. The next video I'm going to do, I think we'll go into my philosophy on steroids, cycles, and all those different things, and how the industry has leaned far heavier into steroid use the further down the volume path we have gone. So, thanks for stopping by. Leave a like and subscribe. Appreciate you. Peace be with you.